Connecting with my friends, love it. Connecting with some sketchy guy that needs remote access to my computer, really?
We hear you. That's why AARP created the Fraud Watch Network.
If you don't think this is right for me when you think AARP, then you don't know AARP.
I'm Rachel DiResto with Center for Planning Excellence. Thank you for attending the summit today, and I want to start by giving special thanks to our sponsor for this panel, which is HNTB, and we're delighted to have Brian Jones on the panel. And the panel is called The Next Wave of Mobility Planning. And so I was thinking of this panel just the other day when I was driving around Baton Rouge and stuck in frustrating traffic. I know you've been there. But looking at all the cars ahead of me and behind me, I had my kids in the back seat, I said, what would y'all do about this in the future? Because these are, issues you're gonna have to think about, and doesn't it make you mad to be stuck in traffic every day? So interestingly, my son took a look and he said, here's what I'd do. I'd make all cars in the future thinner and smaller. So they can just zip around each other, we can build more lanes, and that's what we do. My daughter, who had done her research, pointed out that in Mexico, the most congested cities in the world, they only allow certain cars of color to travel on certain days. So yellow cars on Fridays, red cars on Mondays. And I thought, oh wow, that's great. Of course, my husband, he's the real visionary. He just wants to teleport. But I know you're at this panel because you're wondering how we're going to tackle moving more and more people more efficiently in the future. And we know transportation planning and design has a direct impact on development patterns, travel mode choices, property values, infrastructure costs, redevelopment potential, resiliency, and our fundamental quality of life. And so we've assembled these great speakers here today because you know about some of these problems in our region. And CPEX has always promoted a balanced approach of ensuring we have choices for how we move around, including cars, transit, passenger rail, bikes, and sidewalks. And we know that a coordinated mobility strategy requires consensus about our priorities among local, regional, state, and federal partners. But this coordinated approach involves understanding mobility patterns at various scales. And so today, we're going to talk about these various scales, and I'm going to get us oriented. We're going to talk about the region-to-region and super-regional scale with projects such as linking Baton Rouge and New Orleans, but even beyond that, linking Shreveport to Atlanta and beyond. We're also going to be talking about the region and the community. And the regional scale is usually an area where the commute patterns are typically driven by jobs located in the central area like Baton Rouge, and the outlying parishes are considered part of that metro area, but also part of that commute shed. And then, of course, this community to block scale is where we're really connecting hubs and anchors, such as the tram project that's going to connect downtown to LSU. So our speakers today are going to talk about these concepts and initiatives that fall along these various scales. So I will start by introducing them now. We have Stephen Stansberry, who is Vice President of Kimley Horn and Associates, and he's a strategic planner with 22 years of experience who leads a studio of planners in Kimley Horn's Charlotte, North Carolina office. His emphasis has been on the development of sustainable solutions that recognize the inherent relationship between land use, urban form, mobility, and community vitality. He has a passion for urban places, is a daily bike commuter, and has assisted with the development of a recent mobility strategies in Austin, Asheville, and Washington, D.C. And these recognizable places all share a common challenge: implementing strategies in constrained settings. And so Stephen's currently working with the Crisis Coalition on the creation of a resilient mobility strategy for the Baton Rouge region. Next, we'll have Derek Chisholm, who's the planning section lead of transportation in the New Orleans office for AECOM. Derek is a senior planner with AECOM in New Orleans and specializes in complex projects with significant public involvement components. He has managed transportation demand management programs, we're going to call those TDMs, in Oregon and Washington, and is now leading TDM projects in Southeast Texas and in both Baton Rouge and New Orleans. Derek is a contributing author to 2 books due out in 2017, Bicycle Urbanism, Reimagining Bicycle-Friendly Cities, and Engineering for Sustainable Communities. He is AECOM's national lead for Complete Streets, and the Baton Rouge region will be the first region in the state to have a pilot TDM program. We're excited to hear more about that. And then, of course, Brian Jones, who is Central Division Strategic Planning Officer for HNTB Corporation. Brian is an Associate Vice President and Strategic Planning Leader for HNTB, which is a national engineering and architecture firm. He leads the firm's internal strategic planning process and manages the external and government relation programs in the Gulf Coast region. He served in project leadership roles in both Louisiana passenger rail feasibility studies and the recently completed Baton Rouge streetcar environmental and conceptual design project. He is civically engaged with a number of organizations in Baton Rouge and New Orleans, including the Super Region Committee, which is a joint organization of the Baton Rouge Area Chamber and GNO Inc. to promote Baton Rouge to New Orleans metropolitan areas as one region. And now I'm going to turn it over to Stephen. Oh, sorry. I will turn it over to Brian.
Good morning. Thank you, Rachel, and again, thanks to CPEX for, again, putting on a great conference. Cardell, your board and staff are to be commended, again, for once again putting on a great conference. I'm going to jump ahead a bit and talk about some of the real projects that are ongoing as it relates to transit connections and regional connectivity. Derek and will follow and talk a little bit about more of the planning aspects and the theory behind the projects, but I know many of you are probably eager to hear about the status of some of these ongoing infrastructure projects, particularly regional rail, as well as the Tramlink project between downtown and LSU. So we'll start more at the higher level region, looking at the restoration of potentially the Gulf Coast rail, passenger rail along the Gulf Coast, eastward to Orlando, Florida. We'll then transition from there and looking at the restoration, or actually the introduction of passenger rail along the I-20 corridor, potentially connecting the great cities of Dallas and ultimately Atlanta. We'll then transition to the Baton Rouge to New Orleans rail project, and one that has been discussed for many years and has progressed over the last really year since the governor's been elected and voiced his support for the project. And then finally, I'll wrap up with some of the details of the Tramlink BR project now that we've wrapped up the environmental and conceptual engineering phase and are moving into the actual design. So for along the Gulf Coast, this project is one that, passenger rail was running along the Gulf Coast for many years as a component of the Sunset Limited that ran along the Gulf Coast, essentially from Los Angeles all the way to Florida. Now, that service was discontinued following Hurricane Katrina when the hurricane destroyed the tracks along the Gulf Coast. The rail was eventually restored and the tracks were replaced. However, service was never re-implemented along that route. And so there's been a lot of discussion about that service and the need to restore that service along the Gulf Coast. Just last year in the FAST Act, the Federal Transportation Bill, a working group was established by a bipartisan group of leaders in Congress to look in depth and to study what it would take in order to restore some type of passenger service along the Gulf Coast. 2 scenarios are actually under consideration by this working group. The first being looking at the Chicago to New Orleans route and eventually then taking that train eastward to Orlando on a daily run. And additionally then another shorter run from New Orleans to Mobile, a daily run there as well. You know, some connections do exist, believe it or not, to Louisiana with passenger rail. You'll see here that that there is passenger rail service going westward to Los Angeles. There's passenger rail connections going north to Chicago as well as to Washington, D.C. Of course, we know of the passenger rail connections that exist along the eastern seaboard, very heavily traveled. Many of you, if you've traveled between Washington and New York, you know the business train, the Acela, that is probably the most popular passenger rail service in the United States. But again, the connection that did exist that has not yet been restored is that connection that continues along the Gulf Coast through Louisiana and ultimately to Florida, to Jacksonville, and then downward to Orlando. And again, and as this conference has illustrated, this is really about making connections between regions and people and large population centers. And you see here illustrated that, you know, there's 11 mega regions really within the United States. 75% of the population resides in these mega regions. And you'll see here along the Gulf Coast with the Gulf Coast mega region and the Florida mega region there that it would only make sense, right, that these mega regions were connected by some sort of permanent transportation, rail-based transportation system. Again, the demand is growing. If you look here between 2004 and 2015, the percentage of ridership growth within the four states illustrated there, you know, traditionally, right, states that have not been transit friendly. Particularly Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi. But as you see there, I mean, the numbers really speak for themselves in that there is a percentage growth occurring, and we're beginning to see that demand is picking up. I spoke a little bit about the FAST Act working group that was established by the FAST Act, and as part of that legislation, this working group was established between Amtrak and FRA. It was funded in the FAST Act with $1 million in the federal transportation bill, again, really to look at the details of what it would take to restore the service. It's going to require significant coordination with the freight railroad that exists and runs daily freight traffic along there, and that's CSX. And what this working group did as one of its initial actions was to put an inspection train in partnership with Amtrak along the route. And this was done earlier in the year. As you can see here, this was one of the stops. You know, it's important to note that it was a bipartisan effort. You see at the podium there, Republican Mississippi Senator Roger Wicker. You also see sitting in the chair there, the Republican governor of Mississippi, Phil Bryant. Again, very telling that this was a bipartisan effort to look at the restoration of passenger service, which has traditionally not been, right, a conservative or Republican issue. This inspection train, which I had the great fortune of riding, was an exciting trip. It was to gauge community support for the restoration of the rail, which I will tell you that every stop there were hundreds of people at each stop waving banners and signs and flags, just thrilled to see a passenger train come through these communities for the first time since Hurricane Katrina. And more importantly, the train did serve a technical purpose as well in looking at the assessment of the track conditions and to see what it would take from a technical perspective in order to get the tracks where they need to be to run daily passenger service. The working group was really charged by Congress with four main tasks. Evaluate the options for restoring the passenger service. How many runs? What would the service look like? How many trains? Would it be daily? Would it be every other day? Select that preferred option for services as I just mentioned. Look at what it would take from a capital needs perspective in order to get the rails where they needed to be, to ensure that there were proper sidings for the freight railroad as well as the passenger trains to coexist. What stations have been restored since Katrina and which have not? And what would it take from a station planning and station construction perspective in order to allow this train to function? And of course, identifying funding sources for the capital needs as well as for any ongoing operational funds. So in summary, as I mentioned, this was a bipartisan effort. This is an ongoing project that continues to be looked at. The preliminary report was submitted to Congress in September by the working group. It's being finalized now. I think actually this week there are some ongoing discussions with the committees in Washington and the host railroad. That report's going to be wrapped up and submitted back to Congress by the end of the year. That last bullet there is that if everything occurs as the working group would like to see, it's possible that service could be restored in as little as 2 years. Just quickly moving on to the Dallas to Meridian line. You know, this, of course, is along the I-20 from ultimately Dallas to Atlanta. It's critical to connecting those two major cities. H&TB led an initial study that looked at Shreveport to Vicksburg and looked at what that service would look like in terms of intercity passenger rail service. 79-mile-an-hour service, maximum speeds. It's a 170-mile corridor. We looked at 4 stations, Shreveport, Ruston, Monroe, and Vicksburg. And while this was a great first step, as you can imagine, it's a central component to the ultimate line. But this is really about connecting major cities like Dallas and Atlanta. The feasibility showed, we looked at different route alternatives. We looked at the operations plan. We did a ridership analysis and revenue analysis. We looked at infrastructure needs, looked at station locations and cost. You'll see here that it's about $85 million in capital improvements that would be needed in order to get the line where it needed to be for the introduction of passenger service, and about an $8 million annual operating subsidy. The infrastructure along this line is surprisingly well maintained. This is part of the Meridian Speedway that the freights operate in a joint partnership. The rail is in phenomenal shape, and so with some siding work in order for the trains to pass each other, there's really not much that needs to be done there. The Meridian tie-in is important because the train from New Orleans to Chicago runs through Meridian. The trains that go on to Washington, D.C. also run through Meridian, and so connecting at least to Meridian, Mississippi is critical. You know, Amtrak has a very positive outlook on this route. If you look at the ridership and tie in Dallas, the ridership grows significantly, and the feasibility, therefore, becomes much more real. We believe that this coming year, Amtrak will likely put another inspection train along this route, as they did with the Gulf Coast. Looking at Baton Rouge to New Orleans project, another one that H&TB had the pleasure to work on and looked at feasibility. You know, this is really about the commuting patterns, and we talked about this earlier. If you look, this information here from the New Orleans Data Center looks at commuting patterns between Baton Rouge and New Orleans from 2004 to 2014. You know, there's a staggering 26% increase in daily commuting between Baton Rouge and New Orleans of that 10-year period. And just imagine what's transpired since 2014, right? Between 2014 and 2016. That number has only gone up. We know that increase continues, and therefore there is some demand for alternative modes of travel between the two cities. That feasibility, again, looked at an intercity passenger rail service, 79-mile-an-hour maximum speeds that would operate on the freight rail line that is owned by Kansas City Southern. We looked at an initial service of 2 round trips a day. It's an 80-mile corridor, 7 station stops, and it was critical that we try to get the trains to be competitive with your travel time by vehicle from Baton Rouge to downtown New Orleans. Looking again at the capital and operating cost, there's about a $255 million capital needs that needed to be done. About $100 million of that alone is in bridges that need to be replaced, 60 of that being the Bonnie Carey Spillway Bridge, which is a wooden timber trestle bridge that today the freights have to operate across that bridge themselves at 10 miles an hour because of safety concerns going across that wooden structure. In terms of an operating subsidy, we're looking at conservatively about a $6 to $8 million operating subsidy for that initial 2 round trips a day. The communities along this line are to be commended for their ongoing efforts in terms of looking at stations. Again, passenger service hasn't run between Baton Rouge and New Orleans for over 50 years. The stations are largely gone, with the exception of the UPT at New Orleans. And out of this feasibility study, the communities really took charge and looked at how they plan their stations. So you'll see here just some of the conceptual station planning that was done as part of our study, the HNTB study. And this map articulates where the stations were initially to be proposed, 7 stops in all. Again, the communities, particularly Gonzales, and we've talked about Mayor Barney Arsenault several times. He took the initiative and actually went and purchased property within his city to preserve that land for their station stop and have advanced their station planning as far as being able to look at conceptual renderings like this at what station stops could look like. Again, very minimalist. The train doesn't lay over but for a few minutes. And so at these stops in between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, you can really achieve the goal with a very attractive minimalist type station as you see here. And you can see that Gonzales is portrayed in this rendering. You know, I mentioned earlier that the Governor Edwards has voiced support for this project. Several stakeholder organizations have continued to advance this project and did so through the gubernatorial election. You know, the governor has said that we must look at alternative modes of transportation as part of our transportation solution and has voiced support for this project. There's still work to be done. Obviously, he's waiting for the outcomes of further studies. We'll have to look at the environmental and capital upgrades that will have to be done. But we remain optimistic that as part of the governor's long-term funding solution for transportation, that he has spoke very positively about ensuring that alternative modes of transportation are included in that proposal that could ultimately fund capital and operating for this project. Finally, the operator and governance are yet to be determined. Who would actually operate this train? We know that by federal law, Amtrak is to be allowed on and permitted to run on freight tracks as long as the freight's operations are not impeded. And so it makes sense that an initial conversation with Amtrak would be one that would be further explored. But in terms of the overall governance, that's something that we're going to have to look at in much more detail. Getting down to the local level, and actually one that's very central to the location that we're sitting right now, is the downtown to LSU proposed streetcar or modern streetcar tram link BR. You know, we're talking about connections and transit connections and really the modern streetcar phenomenon that's happening in America. If you look at this map, you'll see the green dots portray cities that are looking and that are planning modern streetcar projects today. The orange dots portray cities that already have streetcars in operation. Obviously, New Orleans, just downriver from here. Baton Rouge is there, portrayed as planning. And as you can see, many cities across the country are looking at implementation of streetcars. You know, the original modern streetcar in America is the Portland streetcar. It's really, again, the first modern streetcar in the United States. It's been in operation for about 15 years. There's a swelling wave of imitators out there, including Baton Rouge, that look to Portland and what Portland has been able to do very successfully, as is demonstrated by their daily passenger count of over 15,000 riding on their network each weekday. You know, Portland, there was a a host of external factors and local decisions that have driven the success in Portland, and many cities, including Baton Rouge, are looking at the success that Portland has had and what do cities like ourselves do to replicate what was done there. External factors, of course, being like real estate boom and population growth, but local decisions as well in terms of how do we plan and zone and look at economic development districts. And as was discussed in Chuck's presentation before, how do we look at planning and building smarter to accommodate for such transit facilities and drive their demand? For those of you who are unaware of this project, just some of the technical details of it, it's a three-mile modern streetcar essentially running from the state capitol down to LSU. It traverses really three historic neighborhoods. You have Spanish Town, you have Beauregard Town, you also have Old South Baton Rouge, with the anchors of the state government complex and LSU on each end. By virtue of that, it serves, again, many neighborhoods, businesses, students, and the destinations and plan development that are ongoing right now along the line. You'll see here a rendering. This is down 4th Street, directly in front of the state capitol, as to what the project may look like once constructed. Just a map articulating the proposed route, and you see there depicted by the blue squares the proposed stops along the route. And a preliminary operation, just so you can see, again, and this could be tweaked as the project moves forward, but just looking at frequencies of stops, hours of operation proposed. You know, and one of the things that we looked at, and other cities, of course, have looked at, is the economic development potential of these streetcars. They of course, bring permanency. They bring rail that once is embedded in the track, essentially are there for a commitment of several decades. They drive that development. They create place. And of course, there's mutual benefit when constructed with other investments, real estate investments. Obviously, they are a job and workforce development creator. Just in the construction alone, there's nearly 2,000 jobs that would come from the construction of such a project. The multimodal linkages, and I know this will be talked about in upcoming presentations, enhancing the existing transit service with CATs and making sure that the connections are there. Improving regional connectivity, where you park once, you have the ability to increase your walk and bike zone. And of course, the activity generators with along the route. You can see here just the sheer number of residents, businesses, students, and economic development that is being planned now right along this route. Just quickly, the proposed ridership for years 2021, and then looking at a 20-year growth, about 650,000 annual riders, growing up to over 1.3 million. And in the interest of time, just quickly, the environmental has been completed, and the city is now advancing with the design phase that will begin early in 2017, with hopes of beginning service in 2021. The environmental, again, is complete. The design will begin, we hope, in January, and many things will be looked at, including the creation of an economic development district that will ultimately help fund the operations and capital construction of the project. So again, I thank you for your time. I'll hand it over now, and look forward to any questions you may have at the end of the presentations.
That was all very interesting. I look forward to purchasing a ticket on each of those lines as they open up. We're going to talk about ride sharing. Ride sharing is about to surge forward in Baton Rouge and in Louisiana. The CRPC with DOTD and FHWA support have put together an investment that is going to fund a transportation demand management pilot project. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that today. And I mentioned the demonstration piece because this is being structured in a collaborative sense so that there are outputs that are easily usable, transferable to other jurisdictions, and that we're going to have representatives from those different jurisdictions sort of following us along the way through our quarterly learning sessions and such. TDM includes all of these things. It doesn't include building things. AACOM likes to build things, as you know. We'll even help you finance them sometimes. But this particular service line emphasizes the need to just change human behavior instead of more concrete and asphalt. It emphasizes ride sharing in many capacities. That's really the focus, but there's also an encouragement and a facilitation for other things that will reduce peak hour congestion, like shifting work weeks around, telecommuting, et cetera. And for this session, I was asked to emphasize some of the technological aspects associated with ride sharing, and so I will do so. AACOM does a lot of this. There's about 100 of us throughout the U.S. and in some different countries that are promoting ride-sharing programs, operating them or managing them. When I joined the firm a couple of years ago, these were the locations where we currently either managed or completely operated a program. We've had some success over the last couple of years in the Midwest. I'm now working in Southeast Texas, managing a program that we've had off the ground there for a better part of a year, doing a little downtown study for New Orleans, and working with the RPC there. And then, of course, looking forward to getting underway with the CRPC and with Kim Marusik here and launching the Baton Rouge Center Demonstration Project. So here's just a little quick look at the numbers. Generally speaking, 10% or so folks are sharing a trip. Doesn't vary a great deal from region to region, but where you can see a lot of variety is in the work trip type. So we do pretty well when we're having a good time. We're going to church, we're going to a fun event, there's 2-3 people in the car. But when we're going to work, we're not so successful at sharing those trips. And so that's what we are going to do, is to drive up that primarily, but not exclusively, that work to home commute trip and get more people in the car. And the effect that our programs are able to have are real game changers. So we're talking about a lot of trips, we're talking about a lot of carbon, and if you understand how congestion works, of course, just 100 trips on a street that's functioning pretty well is not a problem. But 100 trips added to or removed from a street that is heavily congested makes a great deal of difference. And so with the numbers such as these, I show Washington State because they have a statewide program. Every employer in Washington State with over 100 employees is forced to make a good faith effort towards supporting ride sharing and annually reports on its reduction in VMTs and single occupancy vehicle rates. So how do you get that change? It's about changing human behavior. It's about individuals talking to other individuals and convincing them to do something differently. And it's a pretty big shift for a lot of folks. That first time someone rides the bus, there's a lot of anxiety. What if I don't have exact change? What if the driver's not very nice to me? What if I don't understand how to get my bike in that little rack on the front? And so a large part of our effort is just having charismatic humans talking to other humans and explaining all of these little ins and outs. So obviously we bring some data to this and not just enthusiasm and branding. We put in front of folks the savings associated with not having a car or using a car less. You're all pretty familiar with that. There's also some tax benefits that are available to you. So if you set aside some money in a pre-tax allocation to your commuting options, whether that's a transit pass or van pool fees or even bike clothes, that's a pre-tax set aside. So for a lot of folks, that could be another $1,000 a year, meaning that there's also a benefit on the employer side. So they're not paying payroll taxes on that set aside. There's lots of other employer benefits, and as I'll emphasize here shortly, a big focus of ours is getting large and medium-sized employers to partner with you on the program to become an active part of it. And so this is part of the pitch as to why they ought to do so. As I said, it's a people-driven activity. We have found this over and over again, that really it's about individuals convincing other individuals to make an uncomfortable decision. So we do this really by having actively involved staff people who are then working with employee transportation coordinators, ETCs at work sites. So the ETC at a work site gets excited about this, hopefully. We work very hard for that, and if not, we try to find another one, so that they are making this part of their work site's activities. They're putting the posters up about Try It Day, where you're supposed to try transit for the first time. They're putting posters up about Bike to Work Day. They're feeding data back and asking questions that we can help them answer for their own staff. And that really helps. That helps to generate the energy and increase the momentum so that at large work sites there are sort of representatives of the program. And this makes a big difference. So we've worked in a lot of communities that had gone from having a database, a ride matching software, and maybe some advertising occasionally. Adding the staffing makes an enormous amount of difference. Here's a track from our Vegas cruise, because we manage our people in these programs like salespeople. You have to make a certain number of calls. You have to get a number of calls returned to you. You have to get a number of work sites on board every single month. That's the way that sort of that energy level is sort of maintained and measured. That being said, gizmos help. So it really is a human-driven industry, but so many folks like a little bit of technological fun with it. We try to bring that to bear. It can be overdone, which I'll speak to shortly. So in our Vegas program, these are little kiosks. So as people come in to work, rather than go to their respective desktops and log their commute, they can just press a few buttons on these kiosks, swipe a card, and log their commute there. Y'all might also be familiar with Transit Screen. We encourage our work sites to put these up, especially in a robust transit environment. It's just a great way for multimodal trip planning options to be made available to folks who may not go through the 7 or 8 clicks necessary to get to those data otherwise. So the second principle, which CRPC definitely had in mind when they put together the scope of work for this, is to think big. They're thinking statewide. We're structuring this as a demonstration project because when it really gets down to it, there's some technically challenging elements in the beginning, setting up some of your financial mechanisms, assessing your park and rides, doing some hot lane analyses and things like that. But then once a program is up and running, it's not so terribly technical. And so the transferability of these lessons is very high, and the whole project will be structured so that New Orleans, Lafayette, Monroe, lots of other places can benefit from the evolution of this program and then immediately adopt components of that in their respective jurisdictions. We've worked with a lot of jurisdictions that have only thrown advertising out there and thrown branding out there and get very excited about it. And what we found is that it rarely makes much of a difference. I mean, you have to have a good brand, you have to have a website, you have to have professional looking materials, but those aren't going to do it for you much. So we started managing the project in Atlanta, which was spending a considerable amount of money on advertising, but didn't have anybody carpooling as a result of it. So if you can imagine, you're new to an area, you're open to carpooling, you see a billboard about carpooling, are you going to go home and figure out how to carpool because you saw that billboard? No. But if at work, someone in the cafeteria is handing out information and explaining to you exactly how it works and helping you sign up on a laptop, then you really start to get that level of engagement that's necessary instead of just throwing dollars out there at ad buys. Privatization's been very effective almost everywhere we've gone to, but like I said, it's not anything that a public sector agency or organization couldn't similarly do. We have found that the transference to a consulting firm has helped in a few ways, partly because we have this machine and can bring lessons from one place to another. What happens when you get an emergency ride home voucher sent in for a bike share ticket? Well, maybe that's not been dealt with in one city, but we've seen it in another city and we'll just figure it out. That being said, it's really much more about just having the staffing, the salespeople, as it were, out there at the work sites And the private firms are just a little bit more apt to manage those folks like salespeople, and when it gets down to it, hold them to it or improve upon the staffing. So what we've clearly seen is that planners and engineers kind of stink at this. Taking a technical person, which is what we did in a few jurisdictions. We took technical people and tried to make them into salespeople. Didn't work so well because you hear no a lot. You call a company and say, can I come to you and talk to you about, and it's already over. But you still have to get there. You have to call them again. Then you have to drop in, and you can't get past the receptionist. But then you know someone who knows the CEO, so you just keep having to drive at it and not be distracted by having to write technical memorandum and work on other projects. Getting people that are full-time in the groove all day long. They wake up on a Tuesday morning. All they have to do all day long on Tuesday is get people to carpool. For all the NEPA work that's going on, EAs, EISs for large transportation projects, it is seldom the case that any mitigation money is sent towards TDM programs. But there's a perfect nexus here. So when you build a large project, obviously it's going to have a very disruptive effect on the traffic circulation and congestion. I was working in Portland to replace these bridges over the Columbia River. We're going to put a very interesting little bridge in, light rail, bike ped underneath it, very exciting. But the reason I bring it up is because in our record of decision, among the stipulations of mitigation, we included that there be funding for transportation demand management. Maybe that would only be during the construction period. Maybe it would be funding to an entity that outlives the construction period. But not only is it effective at helping us manage peak hour traffic congestion, it's an available funding source that we've neglected to some extent in the NEPA work in this state. And there's plenty of large projects undergoing analyses right now, so it's not too late to fit this in to some of those mitigation packages. And just lastly, you got to make a really good run at it. If you go to the gym once a year, it's not really any different than going to the gym 0 times a year. So if you put a few billboards out, like I said, who's going to see a billboard and go home and put in carpool? Well, all you get is carpool karaoke if you Google carpool nowadays. So, you know, you're 20, 30 clicks away from figuring out where the database is and getting yourself into that database. So, what we have found is that there's a comfort level with ride sharing. That once you're doing it, sort of like transit, you're fine. But to start doing it really is asking a lot of a person, especially if you're not riding with friends, if you're riding with strangers. Do you want them to know exactly where you live before you've even really met them? Sometimes not. And so drop-off sites and park and rides are really important in being able to encourage ride sharing. They serve other functions as well, but it's really key to a ride sharing strategy. And then, of course, those first mile, last mile options and mode choices are additionally important. How do you get to and from the park and ride that's 1.5 miles from your house, for instance? We don't want to lead to or fail to capture the ride sharing and alternative mode potential in that 1.5 miles. So obviously, this is where the evolving technology is having a huge impact. It's really a human-driven process with a database behind it to get people to ride share, but then when they get out of the carpool, obviously Ubers and Lyfts of the world are an option for you. Bike shares, which are underway with Ms. West here in Baton Rouge, and again in New Orleans with Bike Easy with the city. That's a great solution, but of course some analysis has to be done to marry up sites and locations and travel sheds. I really want to emphasize e-bikes. It's a very important component to it. You heard a little bit about that yesterday, potentially. I'm a bike commuter. Most of us who want to be a bike commuter already are a bike commuter, and so it's about capturing that huge chunk of the market that's on the fence. Maybe they've got a bad knee, maybe they've got too many miles to go, and the e-bike is a great solution to that. So take a good look at this photo. Maybe it's a little grainy at the scale. I took it in 2012. You can see that a great number of these are motorized in some way. In many different countries, this is the more common mode than cycling or automobiles, is these small motorized vehicles. I call it middle modalism. We've dealt with multimodalism for years, but it's somewhat categorical. And between bikes and cars, we've just abandoned anything that could only go 40 miles an hour, as if it's not a legitimate part of our transportation system. But you can see how the proliferation of the lithium battery technology is really bringing this to the fore, and there's lots of folks on an e-bike who weren't on a bike in any way before. A study that I did a few years ago in Portland looked at the difference in the acres, number of businesses, and other access destinations from a bike to a simple pedal assist bike to a slightly more robust electric bike. And those are portrayed here by the concentric sort of bike sheds. And so you could clearly see that the park and ride that had a bike share but had an e-bike share component to it would be able to get a great deal more people back to their households at the end of their trip. Obviously, the driverless cars have an effect on all of this, and we could debate for a long time about the direction that takes some of our transit interested parties, and whether or not this bleeds some of that out of the transit market, which I think is a conversation to be had. But the last mile options here, again, especially when we get fully driverless, are very compelling. So most of you have automated vehicles already. The SAE, Society of Automotive Engineers, has sort of a 0 through 5 scale, but essentially almost all of you have automated things. The new Mercedes, Subarus, the Ford Fusion, they're parking themselves, they're braking themselves, they give you a little lane check when you're going to vary out of your lane. That's already here. With existing sensory technology, it sends out radar, it sends out lasers, it sends out computers, it just reads the physical environment. If you put LiDAR on it, which is very expensive, you get a fully autonomous car. These are Ubers in Pennsylvania with no drivers to them, the Google cars you recognize. As you probably know, the Tesla, the Mercedes S-Class, they're autonomous now. You can stop driving right now on the highway, and so long as the state has gotten up on its legislation, you're legally able to do so. But the real jump, where that doesn't have to be a driver at all, is in connected cars. This is a quantum leap and not just the next piece of the spectrum, because at this point, your cars return to and come from a destination that is programmed into them. So when you're done with your car can leave you. The adjacency between parking and the active land use is no longer important. You no longer have to have the entire hotel frontage dedicated to cab stands. You no longer have to have the surface parking lot next to your business because the car can park itself. The Cadillac CTS next year will come out with the V2V, vehicle-to-vehicle technology, but no one else on the road can talk to it yet, but it's already out there. They're putting it out there. You may be familiar with the site in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where they have sort of constructed a faux test environment with tunnels, with different kinds of street signs, different kinds of parking meters, and have fully connected cars moving about through this space every day, and as they continue to dial in that technology. And then you may have heard about 50,000 cans of beer in Colorado that traveled over 100 miles in an auto truck this past month. The driver got on board, started the engine, made an entry in the log, shifted into the back seat, and didn't return to the driver's seat until the trip was done. That's on the road right now in Colorado, and it's now arguably legal in Louisiana, and it's going to proliferate very quickly and radically change how we organize those first last miles and the car ownership pattern in the States. So, there are 2 databases, both in New Orleans and Baton Rouge. They've already been very proactive and have purchased certain software that does a ride matching for you. I would encourage you to go to the ride matching software and put yourself in. Start a profile. Become familiar with it. Become familiar with it to the extent that you could tell other people about it. And if you intend to attend the American Planning Association State Conference in March, go ahead and put that trip in, because it's in City Park No one lives in City Park. Everyone's going to have to get there, a multi-mile trip somehow or another. So go ahead and put that trip in and see which other folks you're matching up to. But if you'd actually like to help us inch up that 1.1 persons per car on a work commute trip, put in your office and your home location and see what happens, see who you get. Thank you.
Hello. I'm going to offer thanks out to CPEX for offering us a wonderful respite from the election cycle this week. I think that we are in grand need of that. My name is Stephen Stansberry. I work with Kimley Horn Associates. I'm real pleased to be here today, and I'm going to share a little bit of a different perspective than maybe our prior two presenters, because I'm a planning wonk. I'm a policy guy. And like many, I get frustrated that the rate of change doesn't occur faster, because I believe that the appetite for change is actually quite prolific right now. And quite frankly, I think solutions are in front of us. We're looking past them, and we're kind of taking medicine as opposed to finding cures. And for that reason, I do believe in a diversified approach. And I want to share a little bit about this idea of community to block level set of strategies. And oftentimes that represents itself and manifests itself through systems level planning and decision making at the local level. And just a little bit of background, I'm a municipal planner from the beginning of my career, moved on to become an executive director of a metropolitan planning organization, and I left that organization after developing our long-range transportation plan, our federally mandated, financially constrained long-range transportation plan. I was very excited about that. I left and went into the private sector and did a lot of LRTPs. I realized that we weren't making headway through our LRTPs. One of the things that you have heard from Chuck today, you have heard in previous conferences, you've heard from your partners at FHWA, ITE, USDOT, smart growth. There's not enough money to build ourselves out of congestion. So we hear this moniker over and over and over again. It's literally been decades now. And yet, we definitely are well past due for a more diversified approach that has effective outcomes. And I think that's the key there, is that we should, as planners, be focused on achieving desired outcomes and whatever methods get us to that. And if we look historically at the methods that we have used, we'll find that we haven't moved the needle very much. I mean, we're talking about 0.5% here, 1% there, and that's got to be frustrating for those who hire us, who hold us responsible for these things. And we as thought leaders should be responsible for looking back and examining how effective have our strategies been. And we only need to look at our own regions and our own backyards to see sort of the anemic performance of moving people throughout our communities by means other than a 3,000-pound piece of steel on 4 wheels. And we really haven't made that much progress. There have been some communities that have done a fantastic job. And there are other places that have hoped a lot and dreamed a lot, and yet we still have not seen, despite this very strong appetite for a more diversified approach. And once again, our partners telling us, you probably need a better strategy because we can't build ourselves out of congestion. So we're holding the bag. We're responsible for this increased level of congestion and delay, and yet we're not finding methods that are working well. We've got a lot of new things happening right now. I think the other two presenters did a great job at kind of bringing forward what's this next wave of options for us. But we do need to look at kind of the structure and the framework with which we make decisions to ensure that we're not missing out on some of the things that are most important. Now, we'll tell you that I'm going to focus a little bit more on cities. I do a lot of super regional and regional work, but for today, to offer that block level and community level perspective, I'm going to focus on cities. And I think the observations here are that we really haven't created a lot of opportunities for our commuters and our families and our employees to bike and take transit. And we certainly have not incredible access, if you will, to passenger rail service of any form, whether that's a streetcar or commuter rail or a light rail option in our cities. And we really do have opportunities to influence transportation demand. We really do. As planners, we have the opportunity to help shape the imagination that has been put forward by the people who participate in our planning processes that talk about the creation of place, vibrancy. And all we have to do is put it all together. And I do believe that it's about time for a new paradigm. We need to do all the things that you've heard about today, but we have to fix the things that are broken as well. And we have to recognize that the new city is a constrained city. In America, we went through this incredible boom. Literally, you could just call the last 50 years a boom of expansion. And it was fairly easy. Easy in the sense that it was greenfield development. But now we're running into the constraints of our own cities, our own geographies. Maybe we're running into the city next door to us. Maybe we've got environmental constraints. Maybe we've got mountains that define our community. Maybe we've got urbanism that is the stuff we value, like Chuck had pointed out earlier today, that we don't want to interrupt. And if we recognize these things, then we also have to recognize that the competition for space and resources is one that we're losing sometimes, more often than not, in a way that's not consistent with what we've memorialized in our comprehensive plans, our general plans, our corridor studies, our small area revitalization strategies. And so we really need to begin to examine how are we going to make decisions in the future if we really are going to invoke positive change. And I think that the portion of this, looks like next slide. This is not working too well here. And by the way, I'm going to get a shout out here. Does anybody recognize where this is, this photograph? I took this last night, by the way. So there are some fantastic things that are happening here in Baton Rouge that you need to get out and take a look if you haven't had the chance today. But this is at 3rd Street. There's a parklet, and I'll tell you, I do a lot of traveling. This is one of the best designed parklets I've seen in a long time. We ate dinner at Magpie's last night and finished up our presentation sitting there at the parklet. I may need a little bit of assistance. Can you advance the slide, please? Is there anyone back there? AV? Maybe not. Thank you. And look at that, manual. We're back to things that work, manual. So I'm going to pick for a moment, and I say this with respect, but I'm a little bit of a geek when it comes to these things. And one of the things that you can go check out, and this number is actually higher now, but National Complete Streets Coalition. Remember when Complete Streets came out and we defined complete streets as this method with which we could move people rather than just single occupant vehicles on those stroads that once again Chuck had mentioned earlier. We all got very excited. We're like, finally, the engineers and the planners, the economic development people, our politicians, they're all saying the same thing. They're using the same vocabulary. And that in and of itself is a victory, right? And this is fantastic. There's 700 plus agencies. I would guess it's probably closer to 800. And I've helped write a lot of these. And I'll tell you, once again, I'm a student of policy. And so next slide, please. Essentially, most of them read very similarly. It's not a surprise, right? Because there's some great sample language that's been offered out there. Many of you may have a similar policy in your community, or it could be at the regional level. Some state DOTs have actually embraced this kind of language, and it's fantastic until, in the next slide, please, we turn to page 2. So we pat ourselves on the back because we've got a great idea. But we don't talk about, the dirty little secret is when you turn the page, there's page 2. Page 2 is where the exceptions lie. Page 2 is where we memorialize when we don't have to do these things. And oftentimes, this list is fairly ubiquitous around the country as well. It essentially says that when we don't have space, when we don't think there's propensity for use, or we don't have enough money, then we don't have to do them. You can almost imagine the pace with which change occurs under those circumstances. Not very quickly. I don't know about you, but we're in the 21st century, and change doesn't occur at the pace of geologic time when we think about culture now. It happens at the pace of real time and in one generation, not multiple generations. And in fact, I would argue that we measure things in terms of progress in terms of the election cycle more than anything else these days. And so if we can't demonstrate progress in a shorter period of time than talking about things over periods of decades, we've probably failed. Next slide. And so our traditional decision-making process that we have to revert back to essentially says that we need to look at the street function. We got our functional classification map, or the LRTP tells us, or we've got a local street type. But then we ask ourselves, well, how much traffic do we need to accommodate? And then how much right-of-way do we have? And from that, we'll derive a street design. And that sounds good, but there are some outcomes from that, right? Next slide. Because there is a competition between plans. So I mentioned in my bio that I've been doing work in some pretty constrained places, whether that's a small city like Asheville, North Carolina, or a big city like Washington, D.C., or a really congested state capital like Austin, Texas. Everywhere I have gone, I pick up the plans that have come before us, and they're good plans, and I've written some very similar plans. I'm not critiquing those necessarily in particular, but when we pick up those plans, we find out that there's a bike plan, that there's an LRTP that's primarily focused on the movement of cars, that there is a transit master plan, and all of them are done in pretty fair to say silos. They're funded with different funding sources. They're done by staff sometimes that are in different departments or completely different agencies. And there is a disconnect, despite the fact that we would wish that there's stronger integration amongst our plans. And in many cases, the very first step we do is to simply map everything and turn them on. And all of a sudden, we're able to create a conflict map. And that conflict map is conflict between strategies. Right? There's a conflict between what the bike advocates want, there's a conflict between what the bus and transit advocates want, and there's a conflict between where the cars want to be, and where the traffic engineers tell us we must maintain capacity for those cars. And I'm a believer that we as planners were primarily educated and put into our positions to resolve conflict rather than to propagate conflict. And I think that's an important paradigm for us to embrace. There's a new way of doing planning which suggests that when we encounter that conflict, first of all, we expose it. Number two, we acknowledge it. Number three, we seek to address it. And if we do those things, it doesn't mean we get everything, but we get something. And when we get something, we see change. This gets right back to what you referenced earlier, which was about trying to change a mindset. Well, you can't change a mindset unless there's an opportunity. Next slide. So there are risks that if we don't break the cycle, despite all the new technology, every trip has a first mile and a last mile, every trip begins as a pedestrian, we really are missing out on these opportunities to invoke transformative change. And you can read these outcomes. The bottom line is that we're living with these outcomes. They are what we saw on the very first slide, where there's congestion. They are devoid of options, and there's a sense of isolation that occurs. There's entire books written about retrofitting the suburbs. You heard about that. One of the authors here speaking to you yesterday. These are the challenges that we face in the 21st century as planners, and we really need to begin taking a lot of these to heart and figure out effective strategies. Next slide. Oh, great. I have technology back, or so they claim. Don't tease me like that. Give it another shot. Great. So my simple question is why are cities changing their design priorities? And there really are a number of communities out there, and some of them in Louisiana in particular, that are deciding that we're going to do things a little bit differently. And the reason they're doing it is a very simple one. Communities are demanding it. Do you remember Chuck said they're not pedestrians, they're people? People are demanding this. There was a cyclist. I bike to work too. I need the traffic signal sometimes to get across. We get these things, and there's a propensity and an increased demand for the use of some other method rather than just commuting to work in our cars. And it doesn't matter where we go. Whatever survey you do, you're seeing that there's an increased appetite for that. And it's fairly well documented. There's a reason why, because we get those two big movements in our population pyramid, which looks more like a silo these days than it does a pyramid. And the boomers and the millennials are really dominating a lot of public policy and decision making right now. And ironically, they want similar things. They want outdoor living. They want options. They don't want to spend any more time in their cars than need be. And that creates, I think, for me, the most amazing opportunity that we as planners have, right? This is our time. Seize the moment. There's an appetite. It's not planners are saying this is good for you. This is the community saying we want this. And so we need to be responsive to that. And so The next question, of course, would be how? How are we going to change the priorities in street design? And there's a variety of methods, but I'm going to focus really on three things, and just to point them out, that when we're intentional about elevating the importance and the value of our mode-specific plans, that manifests itself through mode prioritization. That literally means that when we think about a corridor, we ask first, what's the priority travel mode? And let's build around that. That's not standard operating procedures. The other option is the creation of more modern street types, rather than relying on things that sound and look a lot like functional classification. We need a greater richness of options so that we can better align things like our development codes and our placemaking principles and our economic development initiatives to better correspond with our transportation decision-making. And then the blending of the two, which I'll just simply refer to as progressive street typologies. Now, this is a very simple methodology for mode prioritization. I won't walk you through it. In fact, this is for a very urban place. It's for Chicago. So Chicago started experimenting with this a while back. The one thing that they really struggled with was how do they link context. So they got the mode prioritization part pretty easily figured out, but they didn't figure out context. Street types are beginning to look a little bit more like street levels. What's the level of the street? What is its intended purpose? We define that first and foremost, and sometimes names are so controversial that you just give them numbers. But then there's this idea of the progressive street typology. And this is a fairly simple, and I put this up there for the nerds in the audience who appreciate a good algebraic equation. Context plus street type plus mode priority, all expressed over right-of-way, should equal our street typology. If we were to embrace this simple formula for street design, we would see greater decision-making that aligns with what's in our comprehensive plans and our mode-specific plans, and we would be resolving conflict, and we would agree as practitioners what the compromise is going into the conversation. And I'll quickly just describe what each of these is. The context should be determined by your comprehensive plan, your land use plan. Whatever it is that you use to describe place, that could be a place type set of categories. The street type is whatever that replacement for functional class might be. Mode priority comes from your mode specific plans, but for implementing that mode specific idea here, we don't have another option, right? It's easy to allow a place for cars. It's really difficult to find the right link between A and B for bicyclists, pedestrians, and sometimes transit. And then right-of-way. So why did I put right-of-way in the denominator? So there's a really simple way to look at this. If x over y results in a number, and this is just really getting overly complicated. You can tell I'm wonky here. But if it's less than 1, you've got optimum conditions, you can go to a design table. That means that we can design that ultimate complete street. We've got plenty of space for everyone. But more often than not, we find ourselves in a situation where it's greater than 1, where the demands, the needs that want to be accommodated in that corridor can't be accommodated in the space that's afforded because it's a constrained setting. It's a city, right? And under that, we need to have then that constrained set of design criteria that gets back to mode prioritization. And so the net result is kind of revisiting that very simple expression of the ingredients for street design, going back and looking at street function context, but now adding in what is the mobility strategy that should be considered, then considering right-of-way. Ultimately, that leads to street design. It allows us the opportunity to really memorialize how we incorporate the things that we put in our comprehensive plans, those vision statements that oftentimes are forgotten after the planning process, and make it a part of the actual plan, design, and decision-making when we think about our corridors. And the net result of this is all of a sudden a change in mindset, that all of a sudden transportation is here to be a supportive measure as opposed to solving for X being solving for congestion. When we change the mindset of our communities to think that transportation is here not just to get from point A to point B, but to be a supportive measure to creating economic development, social equity, affordable housing, safety, and addressing things like traffic flow. And in this region in particular, coming up with a method with which we incorporate resiliency as a part of our overall community strategy. When we add that and transportation becomes a supporting measure, all of a sudden, transportation is helping us realize the expectations of our community, our elected officials, for creating great places and great communities. And with that, I think we're done.
Thank you very much, everyone. We have time for a few questions. Yes, sir.
Good morning to the panel. I'm Charles Coates, and maybe this goes to Brian. One disadvantage of trams is the unsightedness of the overhead electrical lines, masts, wires, and so forth. What alternatives exist for underground power or self-propulsion, such as utilizing buses, why we have electric battery-driven buses, or buses driven by liquefied natural gas? It seems to me that technology could be transferable to tram cars.
Yes, sir. Yeah, thank you for the question. And actually, that was something that was discussed during the preliminary environmental phase of the Baton Rouge streetcar. Of course, we know that along the Nicholson route, for those of you familiar with it, one of the biggest challenges with the overhead catenary system, particularly if the car were to run in the outside lane, is the interaction with the historic live oak trees along the Nicholson Boulevard, particularly as you get near Magnolia Mound and into the LSU campus. But to your question specifically, one of the things that will be further evaluated as the project goes into design is whether or not there is the opportunity for perhaps some battery power solutions, lithium-ion batteries. That's actually technology that's being introduced in American modern streetcars with some constraints. The ability to go long distances on battery power, of course, are limiting. And so there could be opportunity, particularly in those areas where there are some obstructions that prohibit the overhead catenary system, where you could use some type of lithium-ion battery power. Again, that technology is ever developing, as you can imagine. Just look at the Tesla model. And that battery power, I think, over time, is certainly the innovations there are going to get better. And that's something we're definitely, and that the project is going to have to consider as you move into the design, recognizing that not only from a aesthetics point of view, but from just a functional point of view with the obstructions that already exist along the corridor. Yes, sir.
Yes, Father Pat?
Father
Pat?
Go ahead, Father.
Several points here. May not be questions, but anyway. When you're developing or talking about the Gulf Coast Railroad corridor, I suggest that you might move west as well as east. And part of that would be because of a possible private-public partnership involving to find the money. You've got a great development taking place all the way from Gola to
see a question in the back. Logan?
So Baton Rouge is one of those communities that fairly recently introduced a street policy, particularly for you, but I certainly welcome any input from the others. I and several others in this room serve on the Citizens Advisory Committee to help implement that new policy. But as you said, one of the issues that communities face as they try to make these types of changes are long timelines. Usually there are waivers that are granted and things like that. But the greater issue is just it's integral to adopting new policy and applying that to new construction. You have to wait for all these roads to be dramatically resurfaced or improved for those policies to be implemented. Have you seen any strategies that other communities have embraced to advance these streets' priorities without waiting for decades for each street one by one to need enough maintenance or enough upgrade money to put in those amenities?
Sure, and I appreciate the question because in reality, what we're talking about are capital programs that are oftentimes required to rebuild a street. And as you can tell, I'm impatient. I'm not a big fan of having to wait for the 10-year, 20-year cycle for a few blocks to be transformed because I don't really think that that increases the access and or advances the philosophy behind why we would want to do a complete street. I think one of the most important things is what you mentioned, which has to do with maintenance. The frequency with which we resurface roads is much greater than the frequency with which we rebuild roads. And with that in mind, I think many places, and I know you guys have begun to do this as well, is to be sure that whomever is the region's or the community's complete streets advocate or program manager, that they sit on the Public Works Committee or the Department of Transportation, whoever's responsible for street maintenance, that you have that advocate sitting at the table. You would be shocked at what we can achieve when we're willing to embrace imperfection. So I'm going to throw that phrase out there, meaning we don't need the full, complete street. We need something in many cases. We may not have room to do a cycle track, BRT dedicated lane, and a robust sidewalk. But if we know what our priority is in those places, then when streets are resurfaced, we should be able to get something. I think some of the great things that are happening right now with the technology that you mentioned is that it used to be what stood in the way was this incredible demand for on-street parking. And that's going to lessen over time. My prediction is that parking is going to become less and less a factor over time as the autonomous and connected vehicles help us solve that problem. And to be very direct in answering your question, another method that has proved to be very helpful is the identification of a multimodal district, for example, where there is at least some agreement that in this area of our community or in these context areas, we agree without debate that complete streets should be the norm rather than the exception. And in doing so, you offer the opportunity to streamline a decision-making process. We're willing to accept more delay. We're already saying right turn lanes are the death knell of the pedestrian walking across the street. There's no need for them in certain context areas. And through the establishment of that, you're effectively saying, you know what, we recognize there's a hesitation to universally apply these things everywhere, but can we agree on the places where we know that they're most important? It's about everything in life. You've got to prioritize. You're not going to change everything at once, but if we don't have systems in place to make incremental change, then more often than not we get no change. So I like the idea of sitting on maintenance committees and having some kind of district where you already have agreement that these things are the kinds of philosophies we're going to embrace on the incremental decisions.
And if I could just layer a couple of tactical suggestions on the strategy. One, of course, read the DOTD's new EDSM on bike and ped facilities and complete streets so that you know what you need to have in order for them to recognize the prioritization that you've done locally. Secondly, in terms of just you and peers who want to advance these things, a quick 3 steps. One, generally figure out where your OD pairs are, and you probably know that if you live here and talk to people, right? 2, measure your shoe so you know how to pace off a street. And 3, find some streets that have lanes that are wider than they need to be. Lots of 12s and 13s out there. We found some 14s and 15s in inner New Orleans. Takes 10 in an urban area, 11 feet maybe in a higher speed area. So look for where the only cost would be the paint.
Yeah, I'm going to close with just another quick thought, because those are really incredibly helpful. On top of that, I think it's important for us as planners to know what we need most. And I think one of the criticisms that we run into is that we're building complete streets where they're easiest and where the propensity for use is lowest. And that's problematic from a policy standpoint, because if you're asking elected officials, you're asking the electorate to support these things and they don't see people using them, there's not going to be support to do more of them, especially when it's a challenging circumstance. So I would map out where the greatest propensity for use exists, where the greatest need exists. Create that list, memorialize that list, advertise that list, get buy-in on that list. Call it your transformative project list, whatever it is that helps elevate the importance of it. And be selective. It can't be 50 corridors in your community. It's probably 5 to start with, maybe as much as 15, but you've got to know that there really are true priorities and then there are desires. And through that, hopefully, we can advance the cause incrementally as those decisions are being made.
All right, thank you, everyone. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but I'd like to thank our speakers. Thank you very much. I encourage you to grab your lunch, and then you can return to this room for the panel, and you can eat and bring your lunch in the room.